The sky is a violent blue. January 1943. High above the fields of Nazi-occupied Europe, a formation of B-17 Flying Fortress bombers cuts through the air like a steel storm. Each bomber, bristling with armament, flies in tight formation, their noses pointed toward the heart of Germany. The relentless hum of their engines is broken only by the deafening roar of machine gun fire, as the tail gunners remain vigilant, scanning the skies for any signs of danger. Below, the German pilots of the Luftwaffe prepare for what they think is just another routine intercept. They see the bombers, dozens of them, appearing as distant dots in the sky. Their mission is simple: break up the formation, bring the bombers down before they reach their target. What they don't know, however, is that these bombers are not simply a formation of aircraft. They are a moving wall of death, protected by the firepower of 16.50 caliber Browning machine guns, each one capable of ripping apart an enemy plane in seconds. And as the first German fighters approach, they realize too late that they have underestimated the deadly power of the B-17's defense. The B-17s, their gunners ready and coordinated, are prepared for the onslaught. The battle has already begun. By 1943, the war in Europe had reached a pivotal turning point. The Allies, desperate to break the stalemate and weaken Nazi Germany's industrial might, had launched a sustained campaign of strategic bombing. At the forefront of this effort were the B-17 Flying Fortresses, massive, four-engine bombers designed to carry out daylight precision raids deep into enemy territory. The B-17s were intended to strike at the heart of the German war machine, its factories, oil refineries, and transportation hubs. With their powerful engines and heavy payloads, these bombers could rain destruction down on the most vital infrastructure, crippling the Nazi economy and limiting their ability to sustain the war effort. But there was a catch. The Luftwaffe was not about to let them fly unchallenged. As the Allies pushed deeper into Axis-held Europe, the Luftwaffe, the pride of Nazi Germany, was forced to defend every inch of the sky. But the German pilots were facing a growing nightmare. Allied bombers were now escorted by swarms of fighter planes, and even when the Luftwaffe broke through these escorts, they still had to contend with the formidable firepower of the bombers themselves. B-17s, equipped with up to 13.50 caliber machine guns, presented a unique challenge. The key to their success lay not just in their ability to bomb with accuracy, but in their defensive firepower. Flying in tight formations, these bombers created an interlocking web of gunfire that could shred enemy aircraft in seconds. A single bomber could defend itself against multiple attackers, but when combined in large groups, the firepower became overwhelming. The German pilots quickly realized that a head-on attack was suicide. The B-17s had transformed into flying fortresses, impervious to anything but the most coordinated and desperate tactics. It was in this environment that the Luftwaffe pilots found themselves increasingly frustrated. On January 17, 1943, they would face one of their most significant challenges yet, a formation of B-17s flying over occupied France. It would be a day that would underscore the relentless power of Allied strategic bombing and the deadly precision of the B-17's defensive gunners. The Allied air forces had developed a doctrine centered on overwhelming force and coordination. The B-17s would fly in tight, staggered formations, with gunners positioned to cover every angle. These bombers were no longer individual targets to be picked off one by one. They were part of a network, and any German fighter that approached was vulnerable to the coordinated barrage of machine gun fire. The Luftwaffe, for all its strength, was struggling. Its once feared pilots were now on the defensive. The advent of the B-17 bomber formations had forced the Germans to reevaluate their tactics. But no matter how many Luftwaffe squadrons they sent up, the bombers just seemed to keep coming. The B-17 Flying Fortress was not just a bomber. It was a formidable weapon in its own right. Designed by Boeing in the late 1930s, the B-17 was the embodiment of American engineering, a massive aircraft built to endure the most punishing of aerial assaults. Its main purpose was strategic bombing, but its design was revolutionary in its ability to defend itself during long missions deep into enemy territory. What made the B-17 such a tough adversary for the Luftwaffe was its armament, specifically, its network of 13.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, spread out across the bomber's fuselage, tail, nose, and waist sections. These guns were capable of firing high-velocity rounds that could pierce enemy aircraft with terrifying accuracy. The bombers flew in tight formations, often as many as 20 or 30 aircraft, forming a near-impenetrable shield of gunfire. No single German fighter could take on these formations without risking certain destruction. The B-17's defensive firepower was enhanced by its crew. The bomber was not a solitary operation. It required precise teamwork between the pilot, bombardier, navigators, and gunners. Each crew member had a specific role to play, and the gunners, often young men with little to no combat experience, became the linchpin of the bomber's defense. They had to maintain constant vigilance, scanning the skies for any signs of German fighters and reacting with deadly force at the slightest provocation. At the same time, the Luftwaffe pilots, once accustomed to swarming the skies over Europe, found themselves in a desperate struggle to break through this defensive barrier. German tactics had to evolve quickly. They could no longer rely on simple head-on attacks. The B-17's formations were designed to repel such assaults. Instead, Luftwaffe pilots experimented with more complex strategies, diving from above, attacking from below, or attempting to catch the bombers from the side, hoping to avoid the devastating arcs of fire from the bombers' defensive guns. But the problem remained. No matter what angle they attacked from, the Germans still faced the wall of fire from multiple bombers. Even the most experienced pilots were finding it increasingly difficult to break through the formations. The cost in German aircraft was high. Many pilots were shot down or forced to retreat before they could inflict serious damage. On January 17, 1943, a group of B-17 bombers flew over the coast of occupied France, bound for targets deep in Germany. As they crossed the channel, they were intercepted by a squadron of German fighters, eager to inflict the damage the Luftwaffe had been unable to achieve in the past. They approached the bombers with confidence, believing that this mission would be like many others, a simple intercept, a few kills, and a quick return to base. What they didn't know was that these bombers were flying in one of the most well-executed formations the Allies had ever devised. As the German pilots closed in, they quickly realized that their usual tactics were useless against the B-17's defenses. The formation of bombers, each covering the other's blind spots with overlapping fields of fire, proved to be a far more formidable defense than they had anticipated. As the German fighters charged forward, the B-17s unleashed a deadly barrage. One by one, enemy aircraft were torn from the skies, their pilots helpless as they flew into a hailstorm of bullets. The Germans, initially confident in their ability to break the formation, found themselves retreating in disarray. This wasn't just a tactical failure, it was a moment that shocked the Luftwaffe, a stark reminder that the Allies were no longer relying solely on bombers to get their message across. They had turned the bombers themselves into weapons of defense. The B-17's success was not just a testament to its design, but to the tactical brilliance of the crews who flew them. On that day, 16 B-17s, armed with their .50 caliber guns and flying in perfect coordination, repelled an entire squadron of German fighters. The Luftwaffe pilots, stunned and unwilling to sacrifice any more of their men, were forced to disengage. The bombers had delivered a clear message. The war in the skies over Europe had irrevocably changed. In the heart of the B-17's defensive strategy lay the men who operated its guns, often the least experienced, yet arguably the most crucial members of the crew. These gunners were young, many in their late teens or early 20s, thrust into a brutal aerial war where survival was far from guaranteed. For them, the sky was not a vast expanse of open air but a deadly arena, filled with enemy fighters lurking just out of sight, waiting for the slightest opportunity to strike. Each gunner had a specific responsibility: tail gunners, waist gunners, nose gunners, each one tasked with covering a vulnerable section of the bomber. Their job was relentless: to keep their eyes peeled for the enemy, to squeeze the trigger at the right moment, and to trust in their training and their fellow gunners to do the same. But the emotional toll was immense. For the young men stationed in the rear of the aircraft, the constant threat of enemy fighters and the deafening noise of their own guns created a terrifying experience. The gunners had to remain calm, focused, and coordinated under pressure, often with little more than their instincts and nerves to guide them. In many ways, the success of the B-17 formations depended not just on their firepower, but on the bond of trust between these men. They depended on each other's expertise, each bomber in the formation relying on its gunners to keep it alive long enough to reach its target. When German pilots tried to break through, they were up against not just an aircraft, but a team of determined young men, fighting not for glory, but for survival. At the core of the B-17's ability to fend off attacks lay its formations. The tactical genius behind these bomber formations was a response to the growing threat from the Luftwaffe. Initially, the B-17 was designed to fly in loose formations, but as the Luftwaffe adapted and launched more coordinated attacks, it became clear that the bombers needed a more robust defense. Enter the concept of the combat box. A combat box was a dense, tight-knit formation of bombers, each flying in a set position relative to the others. The aircraft were staggered in multiple layers, some high, some low, creating a shield of overlapping firepower. This formation allowed each bomber to cover its neighbor's blind spots, ensuring that no section of the sky was left unprotected. When German fighters attempted to attack from above, below, or the sides, they were met with the brutal crossfire of .50 caliber guns, which could disable or destroy enemy aircraft within seconds. The tactical brilliance behind this was not just in the sheer volume of firepower, but in the coordination and discipline required to maintain such a formation. Flying in tight, synchronized patterns for hours on end demanded precision and constant communication between the crews. The bombers had to trust each other completely. A single misstep could expose a gap in the formation, leaving the entire group vulnerable. German pilots, who were accustomed to quick, opportunistic strikes, quickly learned that a head-on assault or a simple dive wasn't enough to break the B-17 formations. These bombers were no longer vulnerable lone targets. They had become formidable, moving walls of defense that required far more than courage to defeat. The B-17 Flying Fortress was not just a symbol of American ingenuity in its design, but a technical marvel in terms of its armament. The bomber's ability to defend itself was largely dependent on the firepower packed into its frame. Each B-17 was equipped with up to 13.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, a formidable defensive system that was capable of outgunning most German fighters. The .50 caliber machine guns were powerful, reliable, and deadly. With a high rate of fire, around 450 to 600 rounds per minute, the guns could send a hail of bullets into enemy aircraft with lethal accuracy. The B-17's tail gunners could fire at attackers trying to close in from behind, while waist and nose gunners covered the bomber's flanks and forward approach. This created an impenetrable defensive zone around each aircraft. But the real technological advantage came in the way these guns were synchronized with the bomber's tight formations. As the B-17s flew in combat boxes, the bombers worked together to create a nearly constant barrage of machine gun fire. The overlapping fields of fire were a key aspect of the bomber's survival. If one bomber was attacked, the others in the formation would fire to protect it. This coordination created a deadly, moving wall of gunfire that forced the Luftwaffe pilots to think twice before attacking. The Germans had no comparable aircraft with such defensive capabilities. While the Luftwaffe had formidable fighters, like the Bf-109 and Fw-190, these planes were designed primarily for speed and agility, not for sustained combat in tight formations. As the B-17s continued to refine their defensive tactics, German pilots faced an increasing challenge. How could they break through the B-17 formations without suffering heavy losses? The answer, it seemed, was not yet clear. From the German perspective, the B-17 formations represented an escalating nightmare in the skies over Europe. Initially, the Luftwaffe had underestimated the effectiveness of the American bombers, believing they could be broken apart with relative ease. German pilots were accustomed to striking Allied bombers one by one, picking off stragglers or isolated targets. But the massed, defensive strength of the B-17 formations would quickly prove otherwise. As the war dragged on, the Luftwaffe pilots, many of whom were among the best trained and most experienced in the world, were forced to adapt. Early attempts to break the B-17 formations were disastrous. Fighters would approach from above or below, trying to get a shot at the bombers' more vulnerable spots. However, they were met with a wall of machine gun fire. German pilots, who had been trained to engage in quick, hit-and-run attacks, soon found themselves locked in prolonged dogfights with a bomber that refused to be easily killed. The Luftwaffe's initial tactics of direct assault were now obsolete. The bomber's defensive firepower had forced the Germans to rethink their strategy entirely. One of the more successful tactics that emerged involved the use of head-on attacks, where German fighters would dive straight into the formation, hoping to evade the crossfire from the rear, waist, and side gunners. But even this maneuver came with enormous risk, as the B-17 gunners learned to fire early and with precision. The psychological toll on German pilots was significant. They were faced with the frustration of repeated failure, often at the cost of heavy casualties. It was not just the B-17's firepower that intimidated them. It was the realization that no single attack would be enough to break these bombers. The B-17s were now a symbol of American resolve, a barrier in the sky that the Luftwaffe could not easily overcome. The sky was overcast and gray as the Allied bombers made their way across the English Channel toward their target in Nazi-occupied France. It was January 17, 1943, and the war in Europe had reached a critical juncture. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin and worn from months of fighting, was poised to intercept a formation of B-17 flying fortresses as they flew in tight formation, their guns bristling in anticipation of a battle. The formation, part of the U.S. 8th Air Force, was on a mission to bomb a German target deep within occupied territory. The bomber crews knew that this mission would not be easy. They had faced the wrath of the Luftwaffe before, and they were well aware of the deadly skill of German pilots. But what the Luftwaffe pilots did not know was that this formation of B-17s had been carefully trained and meticulously coordinated. It was a formation designed not just to deliver bombs, but to defend itself with overwhelming force. As the bombers flew over the channel, the first signs of the enemy appeared. A group of German fighters, part of a larger squadron from the Luftwaffe, swooped down from above, their engines screaming as they dove toward the bombers. The German pilots believed they were facing an isolated target, unaware that they were about to meet a wall of gunfire. The B-17s, each flying in perfect synchronization, began to unleash a deadly barrage of bullets. The first few German fighters were torn apart almost immediately. Their pilots had underestimated the firepower of the B-17s and paid the price. As the enemy planes continued to swarm, the B-17 crews maintained their positions, their machine guns firing relentlessly. The German fighters, though fast and agile, were no match for the sheer volume of firepower coming from every angle. No matter where they attacked from, above, below, or from the side, the bombers' gunners were ready, covering each other's blind spots with surgical precision. German pilots, who had managed to close and found themselves caught in the crossfire, unable to evade the relentless storm of bullets. Several planes were shot down, their pilots diving helplessly toward the ground. The Luftwaffe pilots, now fully aware of the deadly effectiveness of the B-17 formations, attempted to regroup, but their morale had taken a crushing blow. The attackers were now scattered. What was supposed to be a coordinated assault on a vulnerable target had turned into a chaotic retreat. The B-17s, though battered by the intensity of the fight, had not faltered. The formation held firm, its gunners continuing to fire with deadly accuracy, repelling wave after wave of German fighters. The battle raged on, but it was clear that the B-17s had won the initial clash. In a matter of minutes, the Luftwaffe pilots, shocked and overwhelmed by the strength of the bomber formation, began to disengage. The B-17s had successfully repelled an entire squadron of German fighters, and the Luftwaffe pilots, many of them disoriented and fearful of further losses, pulled back. It was a moment that would resonate throughout the German Air Command. The B-17s, though not without damage, had proven their point. The idea of breaking through a B-17 formation was no longer feasible. The bomber's defense had forced the Luftwaffe to rethink its tactics entirely. It was not just the strength of the aircraft itself, but the coordinated strength of the crews that had repelled the German attack. The Luftwaffe had been shocked into the harsh realization that the era of easy victories against Allied bombers was coming to an end. In the wake of January 17, 1943, the consequences of the B-17's victory were felt across both the Luftwaffe and the U.S. 8th Air Force. For the Germans, the sight of their best-trained pilots being forced to retreat in disarray was a devastating blow to their confidence. The Luftwaffe had prided itself on its ability to dominate the skies, but this battle had shown them that the balance of power in the air was shifting. The German pilots, many of whom had been used to engaging lone bombers and picking off stragglers, now found themselves faced with an enemy that fought back as one. The B-17's defensive firepower had been tested and proven effective, and the Luftwaffe's initial tactics of scattered attacks had failed spectacularly. The Germans were forced to acknowledge that their previous methods of air combat, honed through years of fighting over Europe, were no longer enough against the new threat the Allies had brought to the table. In the months that followed, the Luftwaffe's air superiority continued to erode. The B-17's ability to fly in tight formations, coupled with their formidable armament, meant that the Allies could launch daylight bombing raids with far greater confidence. But this victory was not without its costs. The Luftwaffe, despite suffering heavy losses, adapted their tactics, attempting to develop new strategies to counter the B-17 formations. The Germans began focusing on coordinated group attacks, hoping that sheer numbers would overwhelm the bomber defenses. For the U.S. 8th Air Force, the victory on January 17 was a crucial morale booster. The B-17s had proven their worth, not just as weapons of destruction, but as tools of survival in the most hostile of environments. The bomber formations would continue to evolve, with the crews further refining their defensive techniques. The results were tangible. The Germans, though still dangerous, could no longer rely on their previous strategies. In the wider context of the war, the success of the B-17 formations marked a key turning point in the Allied strategic bombing campaign. The Luftwaffe's inability to disrupt these bombings had far-reaching implications. By the summer of 1943, the Allies were able to sustain their bombing campaigns at a higher intensity, inflicting even greater damage to German war industries and infrastructure. The German economy, already under strain from other fronts, began to suffer more severely as critical factories were bombed into submission. But the true significance of the B-17's triumph lay in its symbolic power. The idea of a bomber formation, so heavily defended and so united in purpose, was a direct counter to the German concept of air superiority. It marked the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe's dominance in the skies. German pilots, once considered the best in the world, were now confronted with the bitter reality that they could not easily defeat the Allied bombers. The psychological impact of these defeats was profound. The Luftwaffe, which had once been feared across Europe, began to lose its aura of invincibility. For the B-17 crews, the victory on January 17th was a testament to their training, their resolve, and their belief in their aircraft. The mission, though dangerous and fraught with peril, had been a success. The formation of bombers, once seen as a vulnerable target, had become a deadly mobile fortress, capable of withstanding the best efforts of the Luftwaffe. As the war progressed, these bombers would continue to wreak havoc on Germany's industrial heartland, and the skies over Europe would be forever altered. The success of the B-17 was not just about the defeat of German aircraft, it was a victory of endurance, precision, and teamwork. The air war was changing, and the B-17 Flying Fortress, with its 16 guns and its fearless crews, stood at the forefront of this new reality. The battle on January 17, 1943, would be remembered not for the sheer number of aircraft lost, but for the profound shift it signified in the air war over Europe. The B-17 Flying Fortress, a machine built for destruction, had revealed itself to be more than just a bomber. It was a symbol of the evolving nature of warfare, one where technology, teamwork, and tactical innovation could change the course of history. For the Allies, the success of the B-17 formations was a turning point. It marked the first real evidence that the Luftwaffe could be repelled, not by sheer force of numbers or by the strength of individual pilots, but through a new form of coordinated defense. The B-17's defensive armament, its 16.50 caliber machine guns, was more than just a technological feature, it was a psychological weapon. It forced the Luftwaffe to reconsider their entire approach to the war in the skies. The bombers, once thought of as sitting ducks, had proven themselves capable of holding their own against the best the Germans could muster. This shift also spoke to the human spirit in war, the courage of the men who manned the bombers, often far from the front lines, but fighting with equal intensity. The gunners, in particular, represented the heart of this change. They were not just soldiers. They were the linchpins of a new way of fighting, where precision, timing, and mutual reliance were just as important as raw firepower. For the Germans, the lesson was stark. They could no longer rely on their earlier successes or their traditional tactics. The B-17s had reshaped the rules of aerial combat, and with this change came a new understanding of the nature of war. It was no longer enough to be the fastest or the most agile. Now, strength lay in numbers, coordination, and the ability to adapt to an evolving battlefield. In the end, the B-17's victory over the Luftwaffe was not just about one day's battle. It was about how innovation in warfare, combined with human ingenuity and determination, could tip the scales in the most unlikely of circumstances. The bombers that flew on January 17, 1943, embodied the future of air warfare, one that was far from the romanticized dogfights of the past. They showed that the key to victory lay not in attacking alone, but in uniting forces to create something stronger than any individual aircraft could ever be. This was the true power of the B-17 Flying Fortress.